So I'm going to do a little bit of a talk about pattern tracing. So there are pros and cons. So it is another step to factor into the equation when you're prepping for your sewing project, pattern tracing. However, there can be a lot of benefit in doing that. So the first is that it really helps to preserve the pattern. So if you are likely to be using a pattern over and over again, you might want to use various sizes. You might not want to cut directly onto the tracing paper and the pattern itself. You might want to look at tracing over it to preserve the original. Another benefit is that if you happen to go wrong when you are cutting your pattern, so if you are cutting to a size 18 and you accidentally cut through to a size 14, although there is masking tape and you can patch it back together, having a traced version means that the original is preserved and you can just go back and start again. Another benefit to pattern tracing is that it can actually simplify what you're working with. So in front, actually, though this is quite a simple pattern, there are multiple instructions and it might get a little bit confusing. Is a basic summer dress. That's the back and that's the front. But it can be a top, it can be a short dress, it can be a long dress. So there are 3 cutting lengths in which you can cut to, and if you're not used to that or you haven't marked it properly, you might end up with various lengths by accident. There is quite a lot of complication around these dart points, so there's a lot of overlap on the pattern there, so it can be a little bit complicated to work with. So if you were to trace it, not only if you were to make a mistake you can just start again, but it will just simplify the pattern, so when it comes to cutting it out, you know you're working with exactly the right parts of the pattern. Tracing a pattern gives sewers who need to adjust the pattern much more flexibility to be able to taper between lines without there being added visual on the original pattern. So if you had to taper between 2 or 3 sizes, not only would you have the new cutting line, but you'd have all the original ones underneath. It might get a little bit confusing, so pattern tracing can really benefit you there. You may need to pattern trace if you've got a magazine pattern, because quite often they come on sheets that are double-sided. So if you were to cut that out and realise that on the underside there was the other part of your pattern, then you could be devastated because you'll only have one half the pattern. So you will definitely need to trace when you are working with those sorts of patterns. And yeah, and generally speaking, if you're working with people with different sizes but wanting to use the same pattern, so a really common example is kids and pajamas. Lots of people make pajamas for kids. Kids grow or have siblings or friends, and they're not all going to be the same size. So pattern tracing will just allow you to make sure that all of those sizes are preserved and you can use the pattern over and over again. So there are lots of benefits to it. So I'm going to talk you through how to trace on a pattern. So some things you're going to need when you're pattern tracing. So pins are really useful, or fabric weights. So here I've actually just got some very basic washers to weight down the tracing paper. Got my pattern master and I've got a pencil. You may need masking tape, and I'm going to show you how to utilise carbon paper and it's called a tracing wheel, which has little spikes on it, and is very, very useful when using this. And of course you need tracing paper. Now it doesn't have to be sewing tracing paper, it can be freezer paper is very good. I've got quite large merchant paper tissue paper that merchants use to wrap up vases. However, you can get special grade sewing tracing paper that have dots or squares on them, and they're readily available from most haberdasherers. But as I say, you don't have to. You can utilise just standard tracing paper. Right, so I'm just going to overlay this over the pattern. Okay. So again, you're going to need a fair bit of space for this. And it's really important to secure the tracing paper onto the pattern piece, because if you don't, a little shift when you're tracing might mean the difference between a garment fitting and not fitting. So long pins will be really useful. That said, I've got some very useful washers here. So these are weighted, and what you can do is place those round the area that you're going to be tracing. Now again, you've got to be really careful that these don't move, so I think a hybrid of pins and washers is quite a good idea. I'm just going to place one here. So I'm going to use my pattern master. So again, it's these curves will replicate the curves in your pattern. So I'm going to use this to trace with, and I'm using a mechanical pencil. Now the benefit of using a mechanical pencil is that it maintains a really sharp point, and doesn't blunt as you go along. And whilst we're only talking about a millimetre difference between a sharp pencil and a blunt pencil, it can make a bit of a difference with your pattern. So I'm going to mimic those lines. You won't always get a consistent edge, but you can shift the pattern master around to trace accordingly. And what you also want to do is make sure that you trace any pattern markings. So here is a notch. I must make sure that is replicated on the pattern that I'm tracing. So you go around and you do all of that, and you have essentially traced your pattern. Now it's really important to also write the number of the pattern, the code, the name of it, any cutting instructions, replicate notches and tailor tack points. You might also want to add in any balance lines like the waist, the bust and the hip, if they're included in the pattern, just so you've got a really good reference point. So I'm now going to teach you how to utilise carbon paper. Now this is a bit of a game changer when it comes to pattern tracing, and I think once you've done it, you won't go back to standard tracing, but this is brilliant. So it's almost like tracing in reverse. So you're going to need a clear flat surface on which to put your tracing paper first and foremost. So what I'm going to do is, again, trusted masking tape. I'm going to just masking tape this down to the surface just to stop it from shifting underneath, because you don't have much visual on the tracing paper itself. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bit of carbon paper. So normally, so this is a Burda version of it. It normally comes in a blue or a red. In this instance, we're using the red one. And this, you can see, has, I don't know if you can see, but it's been used quite a lot. And you've got, you can use it over and over and over again, and it's got such longevity. It really is rather wonderful. So what we're going to do is we're going to place it upside down. So you want to make sure that the coloured side is in line with your tracing paper. And again, if you wanted to, you can use masking tape to secure that down, but I don't think it's really necessary. And then what we're going to do is we're going to overlay the pattern. Now you have a couple of layers going on here, and you can pin it. However, I do think it's worth just masking tape. Okay, so everything's secure now. So I'm going to take, this is a tracing wheel, and I'm going to take my pattern master. And what is a little tricky is that the tracing wheel won't leave any marks other than tiny little dots. So sometimes it's quite hard to know where you've traced already or if you've left any gaps. But it's a good tip is just to kind of go, right, I'm gonna start there. I know that's exactly where I want to be, and to try and not leave any gaps. Try and do it all in one go. So again, I'm using my pattern master to mimic the that curve there. So I'm going to go in and do a smaller size now. I'm going to go in and do the size 6. So I'm tracing up and over here. I'm going to go across. You don't have to use your tracing wheel if you prefer to do it freehand. Some people prefer doing it freehand, but it's sort of a real subjective thing. It's entirely up to you. I just find around curves it's a lot more consistent. Okay, and then I'm going to do down here. And then what I'll do is, obviously I'd go all the way around the pattern, but I'm just, for the sake of the video, I'm just going to do a little bit of work around the dart. So when we come and take the pattern off, you can see what happens as a result. Now, I'm going to follow that dart line and follow that dart line. Okay, now you're going to want to include where your notches are. So I'm going to just mark it with a slit. And you're going to also need to pop in any markings. So this is something that can be done with a pen. Okay, so I'm now going to take this off and show you the finished result. So I'm going to carefully remove the pattern. And now I'm going to remove the carbon paper. And if I were to get a plain piece of paper, you should be able to see the impact on the tracing paper.